"Did you enjoy the tuition we paid for you, Mom?" my son asked, smiling like he had just given me the world. And for a second I thought I had misheard him because I was standing in my small kitchen, still wearing my work apron, my hands smelling faintly of coffee and dish soap, and nothing about my life suggested that anyone had been paying anything for me. I looked at him, then at his wife Victoria standing just behind him in a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. And I said the only thing that felt honest. "What tuition?" The smile on Daniel's face faltered just slightly, like a crack in glass you don't notice until the light hits it, and Victoria shifted her weight, her fingers tightening around the strap of her designer handbag. And in that tiny moment, something inside me went very still. I had spent the last 2 years taking night classes at the local community college, driving 15 miles each way after my shift at the diner, sitting in classrooms with students young enough to be my grandchildren, telling myself it didn't matter how tired I was or how hard it felt because education was the one thing no one could take from me. And I had paid for every single credit hour myself, $320 at a time, sometimes splitting payments, sometimes skipping meals to make sure the check cleared. So hearing him say that they had been paying for me felt less like a gift and more like a question I didn't know how to answer. "The tuition," he repeated, slower now, like maybe I hadn't understood him the first time. "The payments I've been sending for your classes, the ones Victoria helped set up," and I felt my heartbeat shift, not faster, not slower, just different, like it had stepped out of rhythm. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked over to the small table where my laptop sat, the same one I had bought secondhand from a coworker, and I opened my banking app, not because I expected to find anything new, but because I needed to see it again with him standing there, needed to confirm what I already knew. The numbers didn't change, they never did, just my modest balance, the same deposits from my paychecks, the same careful withdrawals for rent, utilities, groceries, textbooks, nothing extra, nothing unexplained, nothing that looked like help. "Daniel," I said quietly, turning the screen toward him, "this is everything I have." And I watched his expression shift from confusion to something tighter, something sharper, the kind of look he used to get when a business deal didn't add up. Behind him, Victoria let out a small laugh, too quick, too light. "Maybe there was a delay or a mix-up with the bank," she said, but she didn't step closer, didn't look at the screen, and that was the first moment I realized she already knew what it would show. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse, I didn't even ask another question, because suddenly the answer felt less important than the pattern, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The late notices I had scrambled to pay, the textbooks I had bought used because new ones were out of reach, the nights I had gone to bed with a cup of tea instead of dinner because I had to choose between groceries and gas. All of it sat there quietly, lining up into something that made a kind of sense I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, already pulling out his phone, scrolling through emails, muttering about confirmations and receipts, about transfers that should have been automatic, about an assistant who handled the details, and I stood there watching him, not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of distance that surprised me. Victoria excused herself, something about needing to make a call, and she moved quickly toward the hallway, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that sounded almost urgent. And I noticed the way she didn't meet my eyes as she passed. I didn't follow her. I didn't stop her. I just stood there with my son in my kitchen, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the ordinary sounds of a life I had built piece by piece without expecting anything from anyone. "Mom, this doesn't make sense," Daniel said finally, his voice tighter now, more controlled. "I've been sending money every month for 2 years," and I nodded slowly. Because I believed him, or at least I believed that he believed what he was saying, and that was enough for now. "Then we'll figure out where it went," I said, keeping my voice steady, keeping everything steady, because something told me this wasn't a moment for reactions, it was a moment for observation. That night, after they left, after the kitchen was quiet again and the dishes were washed and put away, I sat at the table with my laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly in the window. And I went through everything again. Every payment, every receipt, every record I had kept in a folder labeled school. And I realized that for the first time since I had enrolled, I wasn't thinking about grades or deadlines or the next assignment. I was thinking about trust, about what it means to believe that the people closest to you are telling you the truth, and what happens when that belief starts to slip. I closed the laptop, folded my hands on the table, and let the silence settle around me. Not heavy, not suffocating, just present. And in that quiet, a decision began to take shape. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. I wouldn't confront them. Not yet. I wouldn't demand explanations or chase after answers that might or might not come. Because whatever had happened, whatever had been done, I could feel something else rising underneath it. Something steadier. Something that had carried me through every late shift, every long drive, every night spent studying at the kitchen table. I had made it this far on my own, and for the first time, I wondered just how far that could really take me. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid or even upset, but because my mind would not stay still. It kept returning to the same quiet question over and over again, not where the money had gone, but why no one had ever thought I would notice its absence. The next morning I woke up before sunrise the way I always did, the sky still pale and undecided outside my window, and I moved through my routine with the same careful precision that had carried me through the past 2 years. I made my coffee, measured exactly 1 scoop like I always did to make it last the week, toasted a single slice of bread, and sat at the small kitchen table where my textbooks were stacked in neat piles, each one highlighted, each page marked with notes written in a hand that had grown steadier with time. There was something grounding about that routine, something that reminded me that whatever had been happening behind my back had not changed the work I had already done, the hours I had invested, the knowledge I had earned line by line. At the diner later that morning, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, as it always did, and I tied my apron, greeted the regulars by name, and carried plates back and forth with the same quiet efficiency, but I found myself observing more than usual, noticing the small details I had ignored before, the way people spoke when they thought no one was listening, the way a smile could shift just slightly when a conversation turned. I thought about Daniel, about the confidence in his voice when he had said he was helping me, and I thought about Victoria, about the way she had stepped away before things became clear, and I did not feel anger, not yet. But I felt something else forming, something sharper than confusion and quieter than disappointment. During my break, I sat in the back room with my lunch, a small container of soup I had made at home, and I opened my email on my phone, scrolling through messages from the college, confirmations of payments, reminders of deadlines, notices about upcoming exams, all addressed directly to me, all tied to the account I had created myself. And I realized that there had never been a moment where someone else had stepped in, never a message saying a payment had been made on my behalf, never a record of outside assistance. Everything had come from me, every dollar, every decision. That realization should have been simple, but it carried weight now, because it meant that whatever Daniel believed he had been doing had been happening somewhere entirely separate from my life, and that separation felt deliberate even if I could not yet prove it. After my shift ended, I drove the 15 miles to campus, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, and I sat in my car for a moment before going inside, watching students walk past, laughing, talking about weekend plans, carrying backpacks that looked almost too heavy for their shoulders, and I felt a familiar sense of distance and belonging at the same time. I was not like them, not in age or experience, but I was part of this place in a way that no one could take from me. Inside the administration building, the air was cool and quiet, and I walked to the financial office, not with urgency, but with purpose, and when the woman behind the desk looked up and smiled, I returned it, polite, composed, the way I always was. I asked a simple question: if there had ever been any third-party payments made to my account, if there was any record of external funding tied to my name. And she typed for a moment, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, her expression neutral, and then she shook her head gently, saying that all payments had been made directly by me, that my account was one of the most consistent they had seen, always paid on time, always clear. I thanked her, sincerely, and left without asking anything else, because I did not need more information. I needed clarity, and I had it now. On the drive home, the road stretched out in front of me, familiar and steady, and I thought about the past 2 years not as a struggle, but as a foundation. Every late night, every sacrifice, every quiet decision had built something that belonged entirely to me. And for the first time, I began to see it not just as survival, but as strength. When I got home, the house was quiet again, just as it had been the night before, and I set my keys down, placed my bag on the chair, and sat at the table where everything had started to shift, and I allowed myself to think about Daniel not as my son for a moment, but as a man who believed something that was not true, and I wondered how long that belief had been in place. How many conversations had been shaped around it? How many decisions had been made with that assumption at the center? I did not pick up the phone. I did not send a message. I did not confront him, because I understood something now that I had not understood before, that answers given too early have a way of closing doors that are better left open just a little longer. Instead, I opened my laptop again, not to check my accounts this time, but to review my coursework, the final semester approaching, the requirements laid out clearly, the path to graduation within reach, and I realized that whatever had been taken from me, whatever had been redirected or hidden, it had not stopped me. It had not even slowed me down in the way they might have expected. And that realization carried a quiet kind of power. I leaned back in my chair, the room dim except for the soft light of the screen, and I thought about the question that had started it all, about the assumption behind it, about the certainty in Daniel's voice, and I felt something settle into place, not anger, not resentment, but resolve, steady and unshaken. If there was a truth hidden beneath all of this, it would reveal itself in time, and when it did, I would not need to raise my voice or prove my worth, because everything I had done, every step I had taken, was already leading somewhere they had not yet imagined. I began to notice things I had ignored before, not because they were new, but because I had finally started looking at them without the comfort of assumption, and once that shift happened, it was impossible to go back. A week passed after that conversation in my kitchen, and Daniel called me, his voice lighter than I expected, almost casual, asking if I wanted to come over for dinner on Sunday, saying Victoria had planned something nice, and I agreed without hesitation, not because I was eager, but because I understood that sometimes the truth reveals itself more clearly when you step into the room where it lives. Their house was exactly as I remembered it, large, carefully decorated, every surface polished, every detail intentional, the kind of place that looks perfect from the outside and feels just slightly staged when you sit inside it. And Victoria greeted me at the door with a smile that showed all the right expressions, but none of the warmth. Her voice smooth, practiced, asking about my classes, about my health, about things that sounded thoughtful, but landed flat. Daniel hugged me briefly, his attention already shifting to his phone, and I followed them into the dining room where the table was set with plates that matched, glasses that caught the light, a meal that smelled rich and expensive, and I took my seat quietly, observing the rhythm of their conversation, the way they spoke to each other, the small glances they exchanged when certain topics came up. They talked about a recent trip, about a new investment, about renovations they were planning, and every now and then, Daniel would mention something about finances, about transfers, about managing accounts, and each time he did, Victoria would respond quickly, smoothly, redirecting the conversation just enough to keep it moving. I listened more than I spoke, letting the silence do the work for me, because silence has a way of making people fill it, and what they fill it with often tells you more than any direct answer ever could. At one point, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, almost absent-mindedly, that he was glad he had been able to support both of us, that families should take care of each other, and Victoria smiled at that, a small, satisfied smile that lingered just a second too long, and I felt that same stillness settle inside me again. The kind that comes when something finally aligns. I did not correct him. I did not challenge the statement. I simply nodded and took a sip of water, because I wanted to see how far that belief extended, how deeply it had been built into their understanding of reality. After dinner, while Daniel stepped outside to take a call, Victoria and I were left alone in the kitchen, the sound of running water filling the space as she rinsed dishes with careful movements, and I stood beside her, drying a plate slowly, deliberately, and I said her name, not loudly, not sharply, just enough to draw her attention. She looked at me then, really looked this time, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped, not completely, but enough for me to see the tension underneath, the calculation, the awareness that something had shifted. You have been very helpful to Daniel, I said, my voice calm, neutral, and she nodded quickly. almost too quickly, saying that she handled most of the financial organization, that it was easier that way, that Daniel trusted her with those details. And I let her speak, let her explain without interruption, because every word she chose seemed to confirm what I already knew without her realizing it. I did not accuse her. I did not ask about the money directly. I simply said, "That is a lot of responsibility." And she smiled again. But this time it did not reach her eyes, and in that moment, I understood something important, that whatever had happened had not been an accident. It had been a choice, a series of small, deliberate decisions made over time, each one building on the last until it became something that looked, from the outside, like generosity, but from where I stood, felt very different. When Daniel returned, the conversation shifted back to lighter topics, to plans and schedules and things that did not matter, and I finished helping with the dishes, thanked them for dinner, and left with the same quiet composure I had carried in with me. But inside, something had become clearer, sharper, more defined. On the drive home, I did not feel hurt the way I might have once expected to. I felt focused, as if a path that had been slightly blurred was now coming into view, each step ahead of me more certain than the last. Over the next few days, I paid attention to everything, to the emails Daniel sent, to the way he referenced payments, to the casual mentions of support that no longer matched the reality I knew, and I began to piece together a pattern, not through confrontation, but through observation, through patience, through the quiet accumulation of details that, when placed side by side, formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. I realized that the truth did not need to be forced into the open, it only needed time, and I had learned, perhaps later in life than most, that time, when used carefully, can be more powerful than any immediate reaction. I returned to my studies with a renewed sense of purpose, not because I needed to prove anything to them, but because I understood now that what I was building had nothing to do with their perception. It was mine, entirely mine, and every assignment completed, every exam passed, every hour spent learning was another step towards something that would stand on its own, untouched by whatever had been taken or hidden. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet thought remained, not urgent, not demanding, but steady, waiting for the moment when everything would come together in a way that could no longer be ignored. I did not confront them after that dinner, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood something that had taken me years to learn, that truth revealed too early often gets buried under excuses, but truth revealed at the right moment has nowhere to hide. The following week settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary on the surface. I went to work, I attended my classes, I studied at my kitchen table late into the night, but underneath that routine, I was paying attention in a way I never had before, noticing the small inconsistencies, the quiet contradictions, the subtle shifts in tone when Daniel spoke about finances or when Victoria mentioned planning future expenses. One afternoon, while organizing my notes for an upcoming exam, I received an email from the college regarding an academic recognition list. It was not the final announcement, just an early notification for students who were being considered for top honors, and I read it twice, then a third time, not because I did not understand it, but because I needed to let it settle, needed to feel the weight of what it meant without rushing past it. I closed the email slowly and sat back in my chair, the room quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock, and for a moment, I allowed myself to remember how this had started, not with ambition or recognition, but with a simple decision to keep going when it would have been easier to stop. That evening, I called Daniel, not to discuss the money, not to question anything, but to invite him and Victoria to my graduation ceremony, my voice steady, neutral, giving nothing away, and he responded with immediate enthusiasm, saying of course they would be there, that they would not miss it, that they were proud of me, and I listened carefully to those words, to the confidence behind them, to the assumption that they understood my journey. Victoria took the phone briefly, her tone warm, almost overly so, asking about the details, the time, the location, and I provided them without hesitation, because this was not a moment to withhold information, it was a moment to let everything unfold exactly as it should. In the days that followed, I continued my routine with quiet focus, but there was a new layer beneath it, a sense of alignment. As if all the scattered pieces of the past 2 years were slowly moving into place, each one finding its position without force or urgency. At the diner, I worked my shifts as usual, but even there, I felt a difference, not in the tasks themselves, but in how I carried them. There was a steadiness in my movements, a calm that came from knowing something was approaching, something that did not require me to act, only to be present. On campus, my professors treated me with a kind of respect that had grown over time, not because of my age, but because of my consistency, my work, the quiet determination that had defined every assignment I had submitted. And when one of them stopped me after class to say that I had set an example for others, I thanked him politely, but inside, I understood that the example I had set was not just about academics. It was about endurance, about continuing forward without needing acknowledgement. As graduation day drew closer, I noticed the way Daniel spoke about it with others, the pride in his voice, the way he mentioned supporting me, framing my success as something connected to him. And I did not interrupt. I did not correct him, because I wanted him to stand fully in that belief, to carry it with him into the moment where it would meet reality. Victoria, on the other hand, became more attentive in subtle ways, asking more questions, offering small gestures of encouragement. But there was a tension beneath it, a carefulness in her tone that had not been there before, as if she was aware that something was shifting but could not yet define what it was. The night before graduation, I laid out my clothes with the same care I had used when preparing for my very first class, a simple outfit, neat, appropriate, nothing extravagant, because this moment was not about appearance, it was about everything that had led to it. I stood in front of the mirror for a brief moment, not to admire anything, but to acknowledge the person I had become through this process, the lines on my face, the steadiness in my eyes, the quiet confidence that had replaced the uncertainty I once carried. The next morning, I arrived at the campus early, the air crisp, the sky clear, and I walked across the grounds with a sense of calm that surprised even me. Students gathered in groups, families arriving with cameras and flowers, voices filling the space with anticipation, and I moved through it all without urgency, taking my seat among the other graduates, blending into the moment rather than standing apart from it. When Daniel and Victoria arrived, I saw them from a distance, their presence unmistakable, their posture confident, their expressions expectant, and I noticed the way Daniel scanned the crowd, looking for me with a sense of ownership, as if he already knew the story that was about to unfold. I did not wave. I did not call out. I simply watched as they found their seats, as they settled in, as they prepared to witness what they believed they already understood. And as the ceremony began, as the first names were called, as the speeches started, I felt that same stillness settle within me once more, not heavy, not tense, just clear, because I knew that the moment I had been quietly building toward was no longer ahead of me. It was here, unfolding exactly as it should, and this time, there would be no misunderstanding, no assumption left unchallenged, only the truth, spoken clearly, in a place where everyone would hear it. The ceremony moved forward in a steady rhythm, names called one after another, applause rising and falling like waves that never quite reached the shore, and I sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening without really hearing, because I was aware of something deeper than the sound of voices or the rustle of programs in the crowd. I was aware of the moment approaching, the one that had been quietly building over months, over years, through every decision I had made when no one was watching. Daniel sat a few rows back with Victoria, and I could feel their presence without turning around, the expectation in the way they leaned forward slightly, the confidence in how they watched the stage, as if this was a story they already understood, as if they were waiting for a confirmation of what they believed to be true. A speaker stepped up to the podium, delivering remarks about perseverance, about dedication, about the journeys that had brought each student to this point, and I listened with a calm detachment, not because the words were untrue, but because I had lived them in a way that did not need to be explained. Every late night, every quiet sacrifice had already spoken for itself. Then the dean returned to the microphone, the tone of the ceremony shifting just slightly, becoming more focused, more deliberate, and I felt that stillness inside me settle even deeper, like the final piece of something falling into place. Before we conclude, he said, we would like to recognize a student whose achievement represents not only academic excellence, but extraordinary commitment and resilience. and I heard a subtle murmur move through the audience, a shift in attention, and I remained exactly as I was, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. Daniel straightened in his seat. I could sense it without looking, the anticipation rising in him, because this was the kind of recognition he valued, the kind of moment he understood. And Victoria leaned slightly closer, her attention sharpened, her gaze fixed on the stage. This student maintained the highest academic standing in the graduating class, the dean continued, while balancing full-time work and overcoming significant personal challenges. And for a brief second, the room felt smaller, quieter, as if everything had narrowed to a single point. I did not move, I did not react, because I had learned that the most powerful moments do not require preparation. They simply arrive, and you meet them exactly as you are. "It is my honor," he said, pausing just long enough to let the weight of the words settle, "to name this year's valedictorian." And I could feel the air shift again, the audience leaning in, the expectation building, and somewhere behind me, I sensed Daniel's certainty, the belief that whatever was about to happen would align with the story he had been telling himself. "Eleanor Brooks," the dean said clearly, and for a moment, there was a silence that felt almost deliberate, as if the room needed a second to catch up with what had just been spoken, and then the applause began, rising steadily, filling the space with a sound that was both distant and immediate at the same time. I stood up slowly, not because I needed time, but because there was no reason to rush, and I turned toward the stage with the same composure I had carried through every step of this journey. As I walked forward, I allowed myself one brief glance toward the audience, not searching, not seeking approval, just observing, and I saw Daniel's expression shift, the confidence replaced by something else, something uncertain, something that did not quite fit with the version of events he had believed in. And beside him, Victoria sat very still, her posture rigid, her face carefully controlled, but her eyes no longer steady. I continued walking, each step measured, grounded, not because I was thinking about them, but because I was aware of what this moment represented, not just recognition, but clarity, the kind that cannot be rewritten or redirected. When I reached the stage, the dean shook my hand, his expression warm, genuine, and he handed me the certificate with a quiet word of congratulations, and I nodded, acknowledging it without exaggeration, because the significance of this moment did not need to be amplified. It was already complete. Standing at the podium, I looked out at the audience, at the faces turned toward me, at the attention that had settled fully on this moment, and I understood that whatever had been hidden, whatever had been misrepresented, had now been placed in a context where it could not remain unclear. I began to speak, my voice steady, even, carrying easily through the room, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I was simply stating what was true, that this journey had been mine, that every step had been taken with intention, that every challenge had been met without expectation of assistance. I did not mention Daniel. I did not mention Victoria. I did not need to, because the absence of their involvement was already evident in the way this story unfolded, in the way it stood on its own without their contribution. As I finished, the applause returned, stronger this time, more certain, and I stepped back from the podium, allowing the moment to settle, to exist fully without interruption. And as I walked off the stage, I knew that whatever came next would not be defined by what had been taken or misrepresented, but by what had been clearly, undeniably revealed in front of everyone, including the two people who had believed they already understood everything. When I stepped down from the stage, the applause still followed me, not loud enough to feel overwhelming, but steady enough to feel real, and I returned to my seat with the same calm I had carried with me the entire time, placing the certificate carefully on my lap, as if it were simply another piece of paper, even though I understood what it represented. The ceremony continued, more names called, more applause rising and falling, but something had shifted in the room, something subtle but unmistakable, and I could feel it in the way people glanced toward me now, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if they had just been introduced to a story they had not expected to hear. When the final announcements were made and the ceremony officially ended, the crowd began to move, families standing, voices lifting, the air filling with congratulations and laughter, and I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the movement to pass around me rather than rushing into it. Eventually, I stood, smoothing my dress slightly, and turned toward the aisle, and that was when I saw Daniel standing there, waiting, his expression caught somewhere between pride and confusion, as if he had not yet decided which feeling belonged to him. Victoria stood just behind him, her posture composed, her face carefully arranged into something that resembled a smile, but it did not reach her eyes, and for a brief moment, none of us spoke. "Mom," Daniel said finally, his voice softer than usual, uncertain in a way I had rarely heard before. That was incredible, and I nodded, not dismissing the compliment, but not expanding on it either, because there was nothing I needed to add. "Thank you," I said simply, my tone even, and he shifted his weight slightly, glancing down at the certificate in my hands, then back at my face, as if searching for something that would help him reconcile what he had just witnessed with what he believed to be true. "I did not realize," he began, then paused, the sentence unfinished, and I could see the question forming, not fully shaped, not yet spoken, and I waited, giving him the space to complete it if he chose to. With the tuition, with everything," he said, his words losing their structure as he tried to fit them into a reality that no longer aligned. And I watched him quietly, not interrupting, not correcting, simply allowing the moment to unfold. Victoria stepped forward then, her voice smooth, controlled. "Daniel has always been very supportive," she said, directing the statement toward me, but also toward the space around us, as if it needed to be heard by more than just the three of us. And I met her gaze briefly, long enough to acknowledge the statement, but not long enough to engage with it. "Support can take many forms," I replied, my voice calm, neutral, and I saw the slight tightening in her expression, the way her eyes shifted just a fraction before returning to their composed state. Daniel looked between us, something unsettled in his posture now. The certainty he had carried earlier replaced by something more fragile, more uncertain, and for the first time, he seemed to be looking at me not as someone he understood, but as someone he was trying to understand. "Mom, I need to check something," he said suddenly, pulling out his phone again, his movements more deliberate this time, less confident, and I did not stop him, did not question what he was doing, because I knew that whatever he was about to discover would come from his own effort, not from anything I needed to say. We stood there for a few minutes, the noise of the crowd continuing around us, people passing by, offering congratulations, shaking my hand, each interaction brief, polite, reinforcing what had already been made clear on the stage, and through it all, Daniel remained focused on his phone, scrolling, searching, his brow furrowed in concentration. Victoria remained beside him, her stillness more pronounced now, her attention fixed not on me, but on him, as if she was trying to anticipate what he would find, what he would say, and how it might change the situation. Eventually, Daniel looked up, his expression altered in a way that was no longer subtle. The confusion now mixed with something else, something sharper, more defined, and he looked directly at Victoria, not at me, as if the answer he had been searching for was no longer in question, only in confirmation. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice controlled, but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and Victoria nodded once, her composure still intact, but the tension beneath it now visible, undeniable. I did not follow them. I did not ask what they would discuss, because whatever conversation they were about to have belonged to them, not to me, and I had no interest in stepping into it. Instead, I turned slightly, acknowledging another well-wisher, offering a polite thank you, and when I looked back, Daniel and Victoria had already moved a few steps away, their conversation beginning in low tones, their attention fully absorbed in something that had finally reached the surface. I stood there for a moment longer, observing the scene not with satisfaction, not with vindication, but with clarity, the kind that comes when something unresolved finally finds its direction. And then I adjusted the certificate in my hands, took a quiet breath, and began to make my way toward the exit, not because I was leaving something behind, but because I was moving forward into something that no longer depended on anyone else's understanding or approval. I did not see them again before I reached the parking lot, and I did not expect to, because some conversations take time to unfold, especially when they begin with certainty and end with doubt. and I knew that whatever Daniel had just discovered on his phone was not something that could be resolved in a few quiet sentences between them. The afternoon sun felt warmer now, the kind of warmth that settles into your shoulders without asking permission, and I walked slowly toward my car, holding the certificate carefully but without tension, as if it had already become part of me rather than something separate I needed to protect. When I reached the driver's seat, I placed it gently on the passenger's side, sat for a moment, and allowed the silence to return, not the silence of confusion that had filled my kitchen weeks ago, but a different kind, one that felt settled, grounded, as if something long unsettled had finally found its place. I started the engine and drove home the same way I always did, the road familiar, the turns predictable, but my thoughts were no longer circling the same questions. They had moved beyond them, not because I had all the answers, but because I no longer needed them to move forward. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner, soup and bread, the same as most nights, and I ate at the kitchen table where so much of this journey had taken place. The textbooks still stacked neatly to one side, my notes still open to the last page I had studied, and I realized that for the first time in 2 years, there was nothing left to prepare for, no assignment waiting, no exam approaching. Just a quiet space where effort had already been completed. The phone rang just after I finished washing the dishes, and I knew before I picked it up that it would be Daniel, not because I had been waiting, but because the timing made sense, because whatever he had uncovered would not allow him to remain silent. "Mom," he said when I answered, his voice different now, stripped of the easy confidence it once carried. "I went through everything, all the transfers, every record," and he paused as if the words he needed next were not easy to form. "The money never went to you," he said finally, and I closed my eyes briefly, not in surprise, not in relief, but in recognition, because hearing it spoken aloud changed nothing about what I already knew, but it did change something for him. "I see," I replied, my voice calm, steady, and there was a moment of silence on the line, the kind that stretches just enough to reveal what is underneath it. "It was routed through an account Victoria manages," he continued, his tone tightening slightly. "I trusted her to handle it. I never checked beyond the confirmations, and I listened without interruption, not because I did not have anything to say, but because this was not my moment to explain. It was his moment to understand. "I am going to fix this," he added quickly, almost urgently. "I will transfer everything directly to you. Every dollar. I will make it right." And I leaned against the counter, considering his words, not the offer itself, but what it represented. "Daniel," I said gently, and he fell silent, waiting. "You cannot fix something by sending money after the fact." And I could hear him inhale sharply, not in disagreement, but in the realization that this was not about numbers, not anymore. "I thought I was helping you," he said quietly, the certainty gone, replaced by something more honest, more uncertain, and I nodded even though he could not see me, because I believed that part was true, that somewhere in his understanding, he had believed he was doing the right thing. "And I thought I was doing this on my own," I replied, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, and the space between those two beliefs hung there, clear and undeniable. There was another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I did not know," he said, and I let that sentence settle, not correcting it, not expanding on it, because sometimes not knowing is not an excuse, but it is still a truth. "No," I said finally, "you did not." And I did not add anything else, because there was nothing more that needed to be said in that moment. He asked if he could come by, if we could talk in person, and I agreed, not because I needed the conversation, but because I understood that he did. And later that evening, he arrived alone, his posture different as he stepped into my home, less certain, more aware, as if he was seeing the space for the first time without assumptions. He looked around briefly, taking in the small kitchen, the worn table, the stack of books, and I could see the realization forming, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, the kind that builds quietly and stays. We sat across from each other, and for a while, neither of us spoke, not because we did not have words, but because the silence itself carried meaning. And when he finally began to speak, it was not with explanations or justifications, but with questions, real ones, the kind that come from a place of wanting to understand rather than to defend. And as I listened, I realized that whatever had been hidden between us was no longer protected by assumptions. It was exposed now, not through confrontation, but through clarity, and that made all the difference. Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands resting flat against the surface as if he needed something solid to hold on to. And for a moment he did not speak. He simply looked at the space between us, at the worn wood that had seen years of quiet meals and long nights of study, and I could tell he was trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer fit together. "How long have you been paying for everything yourself?" he asked finally, his voice low, careful, and I considered the question not because I needed to calculate the answer, but because I understood what he was really asking. How long had he been absent from something he believed he was part of? "From the beginning," I said simply, and I watched the weight of that settle into him, not as a dramatic reaction, but as a slow shift in understanding, the kind that changes how you see everything that came before. He nodded once, almost to himself, then looked up, his expression more open now, less defensive. "I should have checked," he said, and I did not respond immediately, because the statement was true, but it was also incomplete. "You trusted someone to handle it," I said instead, not as an excuse, but as an observation, and he exhaled quietly, acknowledging it. "I trusted the wrong person," he added, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice. No uncertainty about where that responsibility lay. I noticed he did not say Victoria's name, not directly, but it was there in the space between his words, clear enough without being spoken. We sat in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not tense, not uncertain, just reflective, as if both of us were adjusting to the new shape of things. "I need to ask you something," he said after a moment, and I nodded, giving him permission without needing to say it. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, and this time, I understood the question exactly as he meant it. I folded my hands on the table, considering my answer, not because it was difficult, but because I wanted it to be clear, because I did not know what you believed, I said, meeting his eyes, and because I wanted to understand that before I said anything. And he frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought, as if he was turning the idea over in his mind. "You could have just asked me," he said, and I nodded again, acknowledging that possibility. "I could have," I replied, "but then you would have answered based on what you thought was happening, not what actually was." And I let that settle, because it was the difference between assumption and reality, between intention and action. He leaned back slightly, his posture shifting as he absorbed that, and for the first time since he arrived, he seemed less focused on fixing the situation and more focused on understanding it. "I do not know how. I missed this," he said quietly, almost to himself, and I did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because sometimes realization needs space to take root. After a while, he looked around the kitchen again, really looking this time, at the small details he had overlooked before, the stack of textbooks, the notes written in the margins, the calendar on the wall with dates carefully marked, and I could see the connection forming, the way all of it pointed to something he had not been part of, something that had existed entirely outside his awareness. "You did all of this," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and I nodded once. "Yes," I said, and there was no pride in my voice. No need to emphasize it, because the truth of it was already clear. He ran a hand through his hair again, a gesture I had seen many times before, but this time it carried a different meaning, not frustration, but reflection. "I kept telling people I was helping you," he said, his voice quieter now. I believed it, and I watched him carefully, not judging, not correcting, just observing the process of that belief unraveling. "Believing something does not make it true," I said gently, and he nodded, accepting it without argument. The conversation shifted then, not abruptly, but gradually, from what had happened to what would happen next, and I could feel the difference in his approach. Less urgency, more consideration. "What do you want to do now?" he asked, and I appreciated the question, not because I needed his input, but because it acknowledged that the decision belonged to me. I leaned back slightly, considering the answer, not because I had not thought about it, but because I wanted to express it clearly. "I am going to continue," I said, and he looked at me, waiting for more, but I did not add anything, because that was enough. enough to define my direction without needing to explain it. He smiled slightly then, a small, genuine expression that had not been there earlier. "That sounds like you," he said, and there was something different in his tone, something closer to respect than assumption. We spoke for a while longer, not about money, not about Victoria, but about my classes, my plans, the possibilities ahead. And I noticed the way he listened now, more carefully, more attentively, as if he was hearing something for the first time rather than revisiting something he already knew. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated for a moment at the door, turning back slightly. "I am sorry," he said, and this time, the words were not rushed, not attached to a solution or an explanation, just stated plainly, and I nodded, accepting them without needing to respond in kind. After he left, the house returned to its usual quiet, the kind that had once felt empty but now felt complete, and I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me, understanding that while some things had been clarified, others would take time, and that was all right, because for the first time in a long time, I was not waiting for anything to change. I was simply moving forward, exactly as I had been all along. The next morning felt quieter than usual, not because anything around me had changed, but because something inside me had settled into a new rhythm, one that no longer carried the weight of unanswered questions. I woke up at the same time, made the same coffee, sat at the same table, but there was a difference in how I moved through each step, a steadiness that came from clarity rather than routine. The textbooks were still there, stacked neatly, but now they felt less like tools and more like reminders of something completed, something that had already proven its value without needing to be repeated. I spent the morning organizing papers, filing away notes, not because I had to, but because I wanted to close that chapter properly, to give it the same care I had given every part of the journey. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. Not a call this time, just a simple text asking if he could stop by again later that afternoon, and I read it once, then set the phone down without responding immediately, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that timing matters, even in small things. When I finally replied, it was brief, a simple confirmation, and I returned to what I was doing, not adjusting my day around his request, but allowing it to fit into the space that was already there. When he arrived, he knocked lightly, a small change from the way he used to walk in without thinking. And when I opened the door, I noticed the difference in his posture again, less certain, more present, as if he was aware of where he was standing in a way he had not been before. He stepped inside, holding an envelope in his hand, and for a moment he did not speak. He just looked at me, as if trying to find the right way to begin. "I went to the bank this morning," he said finally, extending the envelope toward me, and I looked at it without reaching for it, not refusing, not accepting, just observing. "It is everything," he continued. "Every transfer, every dollar that should have gone to you. I moved it into a new account in your name, one that only you can access." And his voice carried a quiet urgency, not desperate, but intent, as if he needed me to understand the effort behind the action. I let a moment pass before responding, not because I was considering whether to take it, but because I was considering what it meant. "You believe this will fix it," I said, my tone even, not accusing, not dismissing, and he shook his head slightly, more quickly this time. "No," he said, "I know it does not fix it, but it is what I should have done from the beginning." And I could hear the difference in that statement, the shift from assumption to accountability. I took the envelope then, not with hesitation, but without ceremony, placing it on the table beside me rather than opening it immediately, because the contents were not the point. "Thank you," I said, and he nodded, not relieved, but acknowledging that it was the appropriate response, even if it did not resolve everything between us. We sat down again, the same positions as the night before, but the atmosphere had changed, less heavy, more direct, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "I spoke to Victoria," he said, and I met his eyes, not surprised, not curious, just attentive. "She admitted it," he continued, his voice steady. "She said she redirected the money, that she thought it made more sense to use it elsewhere, that you were managing on your own anyway." And he paused there, not because he was unsure, but because the words themselves carried a weight that did not need to be emphasized. I nodded once, absorbing it without reaction, because confirmation did not change the shape of what had already been clear. "And what do you think?" I asked, not about the money, not about the decision, but about his understanding of it. And he took a moment before answering, his gaze shifting briefly to the side before returning to me. "I think I stopped paying attention," he said. "I let things run on assumptions instead of facts, and I did not question it because it was easier not to, and I listened carefully, because that was the part that mattered, not the action itself, but the reasoning behind it. It is easier not to look closely," I said, my voice calm, "until something forces you to." And he nodded again, accepting that without resistance. There was a pause then, not uncomfortable, but reflective, and I could see that he was still working through it, still adjusting to the reality that had replaced his previous understanding. "She wants to explain," he added after a moment. "She asked if she could come by, if she could talk to you." And I considered that, not because I felt any urgency to hear what she had to say, but because I understood that this was another part of the process, another piece that would settle in its own time. "Not today," I said finally, and he nodded, not pushing, not questioning, just accepting the boundary as it was given. We spoke for a while longer, not returning to the same points, but moving forward, discussing practical things, future plans, the next steps in my education, and I noticed the way he engaged with those topics now, not as someone who believed he was guiding them, but as someone who was learning to listen. When he stood to leave, he glanced at the envelope again, then back at me, as if wanting to say something more about it, but deciding against it, and I appreciated that choice, because it meant he was beginning to understand that not everything needed to be explained or justified in that moment. After he left, I remained at the table for a while, the envelope still unopened beside me, and I realized that for the first time, it did not feel like something that defined the situation. It was simply one part of a larger picture, one that had already shifted in ways that could not be reversed. Eventually, I reached for it, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with the same steady calm that had carried me through everything else. Because whatever was inside, it would not change what I had already built. It would only confirm what had finally come to light. I opened the envelope slowly, not because I was hesitant, but because I understood that whatever was inside did not carry urgency anymore. It was simply confirmation of something already resolved in my mind. Inside were printed statements, transfer records, and a cashier's check folded neatly, the amount larger than I had ever held at once, representing 2 years of payments that had never reached me. And I looked at the number for a moment, not with disbelief, not with excitement, but with a quiet acknowledgement that it existed, that it had always existed somewhere, just not where it was meant to be. I placed the papers back into the envelope and set it aside, not hidden, not displayed, just present. And I returned to the kitchen sink to rinse the cup I had left there earlier, the simple motion grounding in a way that numbers never could be. Later that evening, as the light outside softened and the house settled into its usual stillness, there was another knock at the door, softer than before, more tentative. And I knew before I opened it that it would be Victoria. She stood there with her hands clasped lightly in front of her posture composed but not entirely steady. And for the first time since I had known her, she did not begin with a smile. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice controlled, but quieter than usual, and I stepped aside without hesitation, allowing her to enter without comment. She walked into the kitchen and paused, her eyes taking in the space, the table, the books, the envelope resting near the edge, and I could see the recognition in her expression, the understanding that this was not a place she had fully considered before. We sat down across from each other, the same positions Daniel and I had occupied earlier, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, not because we did not have words, but because this was a different kind of conversation, one that did not begin with explanations, but with acknowledgement. "Daniel told you," she said finally, not as a question, but as a statement, and I nodded once, keeping my gaze steady. "He did," I replied, and she took a small breath, her shoulders shifting slightly as if adjusting to the weight of what she was about to say. "I am not going to pretend it was a mistake," she continued, her voice measured, each word chosen carefully. "I redirected the money. I made the decision myself, and I listened without interruption, because this was the first time she had spoken without deflection, without redirection. I believed it made sense at the time," she added, You were managing. You were not asking for help. And there were other priorities. And she paused there, not because she had nothing more to say, but because she seemed to understand that the explanation did not justify the action. I folded my hands on the table, not reacting immediately, allowing her words to settle fully before responding. You made a decision about something that was not yours to decide, I said calmly, not raising my voice, not emphasizing the point, because it did not need emphasis. It was already clear. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping briefly to the table before returning to meet mine, and I could see the difference in her expression now, not defensive, not dismissive, but aware. I see that now, she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to soften the statement. Do you? I asked, not challenging, but clarifying, and she held my gaze for a moment longer before answering. Yes, she said simply, and the directness of it carried more weight than any explanation she could have given. The room was quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. It was clearer, more defined, as if the space between us had been adjusted, not closer, not further apart, just different. The money is here, she said, glancing briefly toward the envelope. Daniel moved it this morning, and I nodded, acknowledging that without reaching for it, because the presence of the money no longer held the same significance it once might have. I am not here to ask you to forgive me, she continued, her voice steady. I am here to acknowledge that I was wrong, and I listened carefully, because the distinction mattered, not for the sake of the conversation, but for what it revealed about her understanding. I considered her words for a moment before responding, not searching for the right answer, but choosing one that reflected the clarity I had reached. Forgiveness is not something you ask for in a moment like this, I said, my tone even. It is something that exists over time, or it does not, and she nodded again, accepting that without argument. We sat there for a while longer, not returning to the same points, not revisiting the details, because they had already been laid out clearly, and I realized that there was nothing more I needed from this conversation, no additional explanation, no further acknowledgement. Eventually, she stood, her movements composed, and I stood as well, walking her to the door, without ceremony, and as she stepped outside, she paused briefly, turning back just enough to say, I understand if things are different now. And I met her gaze, not disagreeing, not confirming, simply allowing the statement to exist as it was. When the door closed behind her, the house returned to its familiar quiet, and I stood there for a moment, not reflecting on what had been said, not analyzing the conversation, but recognizing that something had shifted once again, not dramatically, not irreversibly, but enough to change the shape of what came next. I returned to the table, picked up the envelope, and placed it in a drawer, not hidden, not displayed, simply set aside, because while it represented something that had been taken and returned, it did not define what I had already built, and as I turned off the lights and prepared for the night, I understood that the most important part of this story had never been about what was given or taken, but about what had remained steady through all of it, and that was something no one had ever controlled but me. The days that followed did not feel dramatic or heavy. They felt steady, almost quiet in a way that allowed everything that had happened to settle into its proper place, and I found myself moving through my routines with a clarity that had not been there before, not because the situation had been resolved in a perfect way, but because it no longer needed to be. The envelope remained in the drawer where I had placed it, untouched, not out of avoidance, but because I understood that opening it again would not add anything new to what I already knew. It would only repeat a detail that no longer defined the outcome. Instead, I turned my attention to what came next, not in a hurried or ambitious way, but in the same measured, deliberate manner that had carried me this far. A week after graduation, I received another email from the college, this time not about recognition, but about opportunity, an invitation to join a continuing education program, one that would allow me to build on what I had already accomplished. And I read it carefully, not with excitement, but with consideration, weighing it against everything I had learned about myself over the past 2 years. Later that afternoon, Daniel called again, his tone different now, not uncertain, not urgent, but thoughtful, as if he had spent time reflecting rather than reacting. I have been thinking about what you said, he began, and I could hear the shift in his voice, the absence of assumption, the presence of awareness, about not being able to fix things after the fact. And I listened without interrupting, because I knew this was not about the past anymore. It was about how he understood the present. I cannot change what happened, he continued, but I can change how I show up moving forward. And I let those words settle, not because I needed to judge them, but because I recognized the difference between intention and habit, and how difficult it can be to shift from one to the other. That is true, I replied simply, and there was a pause, not uncomfortable, just reflective, as if both of us were adjusting to a conversation that no longer required defense or explanation. He asked about my plans, about the email I had received, about whether I intended to continue my studies, and I answered honestly, not because I needed his approval, but because the question itself was different now. It came from a place of interest rather than assumption. I am considering it, I said, and I could hear the quiet smile in his voice when he responded, not exaggerated, not forced, just genuine. That sounds like the right decision, he said, and I noticed the absence of ownership in his tone, the lack of any claim over the direction I was choosing. The following weekend, he stopped by again, this time without an envelope, without anything in his hands, and that small detail did not go unnoticed. It suggested that he understood this was not about transactions anymore. We sat together at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had been clarified, and our conversation moved easily, not avoiding what had happened, but not centered on it either. He spoke about his work, about changes he was making, about the way he was reevaluating certain decisions, and I listened, not offering advice unless it was asked for, not stepping into a role that had been shaped by the past, but allowing the present to define itself. At one point, he paused, looking around the kitchen again, and said quietly, "I did not realize how much I was not seeing," and I understood that statement on more than one level, not just about the money, but about everything that had existed outside his awareness. Seeing takes practice, I said, my tone calm, and he nodded, accepting that without hesitation. There was no mention of Victoria during that visit, not because she had been erased from the situation, but because her role in this moment was no longer central to the conversation between us, and I recognized that as a shift as well, one that suggested a change in how he was choosing to approach things. After he left, I returned to my routine, not because I needed to distract myself, but because the routine itself had become something steady, something reliable, and I spent the evening reviewing the details of the program I had been offered, reading through the requirements, the schedule, the expectations, and I found myself considering it not as a challenge, but as a continuation, a natural next step rather than a new beginning. I realized then that what I had built over the past 2 years was not limited to a degree or a title. It was a way of moving through the world, one that did not depend on recognition or validation, but on consistency and intention. The following morning, I responded to the email, accepting the invitation, not with excitement or hesitation, but with the same quiet certainty that had guided me through every decision so far. And as I closed my laptop, I felt that same sense of alignment return. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady. The house was quiet again, the same familiar stillness, but it no longer felt like a space where something was missing. It felt complete, defined by what had been done rather than what had not been given. And as I stood there for a moment, looking at the table, the books, the small details that had carried so much meaning, I understood that whatever had been taken or redirected had not altered the path I had chosen. It had only revealed it more clearly, and that clarity was something no one could take away or replace with anything else. The weeks turned into months in a way that felt almost effortless, not because life had suddenly become easy, but because I had stopped measuring it against what others chose to give or withhold, and instead began measuring it by what I continued to build, step by step, in my own time. The continuing education program settled into my schedule the same way my previous classes had. Early mornings, late evenings, long hours at the kitchen table where the light from my small lamp cast the same familiar glow across my notebooks, and I moved through each assignment with the same quiet focus that had carried me through before, not driven by the need to prove anything, but by the understanding that I was capable of more than I had once believed. Daniel remained present in a way that felt different now, not intrusive, not distant, but consistent, and when he visited, he did so with an awareness that had not been there before. listening more than speaking, asking questions without assuming the answers, and I noticed that change not as something dramatic, but as something steady, the kind that builds over time rather than appearing all at once. Victoria did not return to the house after that evening, and I did not reach out to her, not out of resentment, but because I understood that some distances are necessary, at least for a while, until clarity is time to settle into something more permanent. Occasionally, Daniel would mention her, not in detail, not defensively, just acknowledging that they were working through things, and I would listen without offering judgment, because their process was not mine to direct. One afternoon, as I was reviewing notes for an upcoming project, I found myself opening the drawer where the envelope had been placed weeks before, not because I had forgotten it, but because I had not needed to revisit it until now. And when I took it out, I looked at it for a moment, feeling no urgency, no weight, just recognition, as if it were a record of something that had already passed. I opened it again, this time reading through the statements more carefully, not to confirm what I already knew, but to understand the full scope of what had been redirected, the exact numbers, the timeline, the pattern, and I noticed how consistent it had been, how deliberate, not chaotic or accidental, but structured in a way that suggested intention over time. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back inside, then set the envelope aside once more, not returning it to the drawer, but leaving it on the table, because I realized that it no longer represented something unresolved. It was simply information, something I could choose to use or set aside without it defining me. Later that week, I visited the campus again, not as a student attending classes, but as someone returning to a place that had become familiar. And as I walked through the grounds, I noticed how different it felt now, not because the environment had changed, but because my relationship to it had. I was no longer trying to prove that I belonged there. I simply did. I stopped by the administrative office to finalize some details for the new program, and the same woman who had helped me before recognized me immediately, her smile warm, genuine, and she congratulated me again on my achievement, and I thanked her, not with modesty, not with dismissal, but with a simple acknowledgement, because I had learned that accepting recognition does not diminish humility, it reflects truth. As I left the building, I paused for a moment at the edge of the walkway, watching students pass by, hearing the low hum of conversations, the familiar rhythm of a place that continues forward regardless of individual stories, and I realized that my story had become part of that rhythm, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was consistent, grounded in choices made quietly over time. That evening, Daniel came by again, and we sat at the kitchen table as we often did now, the conversation moving easily between practical matters and small reflections. And at one point, he glanced at the envelope resting on the table, his expression thoughtful but not tense. "Are you going to use it?" he asked, and I considered the question for a moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to answer it clearly. "Yes," I said, "but not the way you might expect." And he looked at me, curious, waiting for more, and I continued, "I am going to use it to support what comes next, not to correct what has already passed." And he nodded slowly, understanding that distinction, that it was not about restoring something lost, but about building something further. We spoke a while longer, and when he left, I remained at the table, the envelope still in front of me, the papers inside no longer representing absence, but possibility. And I understood that this was the final shift, the point where the story moved fully from what had been taken to what could be created. I gathered my notes, closed my laptop, and turned off the light, the house settling into its quiet once more. And as I stood there for a moment, I realized that everything that had happened, every misunderstanding, every assumption, every choice made without my knowledge, had led to this clarity, not the kind that demands resolution, but the kind that allows you to move forward without needing it. And as I walked toward the bedroom, the steady rhythm of my steps echoing softly in the hallway, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by what others believed they had done for me, but by what I had already proven I could do for myself. And that was something no one could ever redirect, no matter how carefully they tried.